The dawn comes slowly, like a hand drawing back a linen curtain, and the fields of southern England breathe out a thin white mist. A cock crows somewhere behind a hedge. A bell carries over the low hills 1, 2, 3 notes, and the sound drifts across barley stubble and dew-dark grass as if the air itself were remembering how to speak after a long, hard winter. In the year 1500, the kingdom is learning how to hope again. Pestilence has loosened its grip. Civil wars have ended their quarrel. And there is a new dynasty sitting squarely on the throne, Henry Tudor, the 7th of his name, careful as a bookkeeper and hungry as any founder. He does not know yet what storms his line will summon, only that peace is a seed and it will need steady hands to make it grow. The steady hands belong, mostly, to people whose names will never be written in a chronicle: tenant farmers, dairymaids, carters, shepherds, and the lean boys who chase geese from the cabbages at first light. They live in timber frames packed with clay, the walls brush smoothed and warm to the touch where the hearth has been lit before dawn. Racks of rushlights hang black with soot. A trivet stands ready for the iron pot. A table waits under the small east-facing window where the first stripe of sun will fall. Roofs of thatch brood low and patient over everything. Outside, a wooden gate creaks on its leather hinge, and a pair of oxen, broad-headed, slow-eyed, shift their weight and steam in the cold. This is a country that remembers how to be tired, but it also remembers its work. The largest landowner in England, once you have finished counting the king, is not a great nobleman, but the church. Monasteries sit like anchors on the landscape, stone and discipline, and bells holding in place a whole economy of fields and forests. They own stretches of coppiced hazel where poles grow straight as lances. They hold pastures broken by ancient hedgerows. They collect mills along quick streams and slow. In exchange for rent, they lease parcels to tenants who must coax profit from the soil and, more importantly, regularity, wool collected on time, barley delivered at harvest, pigs fattened and sold before the frost returns. The monks pray at set hours. The farmers keep their own liturgy in the furrows. To step into one of these farmhouses is to cross a threshold both literal and invisible. The door opens low. A man of average height must bow. Dirt has been pounded into a floor smooth as leather. The hearth sits not against a wall, but near the room's heart. Its glow a centre of gravity for the day. There is no chimney to fling heat into the clouds. Smoke moves upward in a slow sheet and finds its way through thatch and gaps in the roof. Dying rafters, the colour of old walnuts. Here, a woman bends to lay a small fire, the old sure way flint. Steel, a whisper of charred cloth, cupped like an egg. A breath that turns spark to ember, ember to flame. Bread will be stretched from barley and rye. A pottage, yesterday's beans woken with a handful of chopped leeks, will simmer while the rest of the household goes out to the fields. Outside, the farm is 5 enclosed acres, stitched to a larger cloth of common. There are lambs under the hedge, a coop of cross-tempered hens, and a hut where the sow snorts softly among her straw. The sheep are Southdown, compact and good for a dense fleece that spinners love and merchants love more. The pigs are a rougher story, clever, greedy, marketable, and the law forbids them to wander. A pig with its mind set upon a neighbour's garden can take a season's work in a single night. So fences must be woven, post after post driven into forgiving ground. Long rods of hazel bent and threaded, until the pen stands tight as a basket. The trick is not strength, but patience. The trick, in the year 1500, is almost always patience. There are hands for every task, though not always enough of them. A tenant's family eats and sleeps here, but so do hired souls who arrive with the seasons, a boy for geese, a girl for dairy, a man who knows the way a plough should sound when it takes the earth at the right angle, a woman with wrists sure enough to turn wheels of cheese without tearing their young skins. Work begins at first light and leans forward until dusk, with a man's main meal at mid-morning when the body is still honest enough to tell the truth about hunger. They drink ale, because water is a wager, and the warmth that travels down the throat is small but reliable. If a child asks why the brew tastes a little like bread and a little like the barn, the answer is simple. This is a household where nothing is wasted, not even the air that feeds the yeast. What the land gives is not given all at once. Spring promises peas and barley, but promises are only as strong as the weather and the animals who share the fields. There are deer that love the sweet new tips of pea plants. There are rabbits with no respect for wedges of thorn thrust into a gap. There are caterpillars assembling themselves, like a well-drilled army on the underside of a leaf. A book of husbandry says to listen to the ground before sowing. If it sings under your feet, it is too wet. If it bears you without complaint, throw in your seed and say your prayer. The old men nod at that advice and toss it to the boys, along with a handful of seed. The boys laugh and try to broadcast evenly. Heel and hand. Heel and hand. Learning a rhythm that will outlast them. Under soil, the ploughman says, and the oxen lean into the yoke. In other countries, horses do this work, quicker and with a quarrelsome pride. But a pair of patient cattle is cheaper and, some say, gentler on the soul. The plough cuts a clean line and turns the field into a book of pages. Each furrow a sentence about rain and clay, and the memory of last year's harvest ground back into crumbs. A straight furrow is a moral lesson as much as a practical one. If you can hold your line across the field, you may yet hold it across your life. Above, rooks argue and rearrange themselves on a bare branch. In the distance, the monastery's bell counts out the hour for prayer. But on this side of the hedge, the counting is of steps and breaths, and the measured creak of leather. If you ask a tenant farmer who owns the year, he will say, God owns the year, and the abbot owns the fines. He would be smiling when he said it. Mostly. Rent is fixed to coin or to product so much wool, so many measures of grain, and the monastery keeps a generous view of what counts as timely, when the harvest has been clean and the tenants show willing on holy days. There is a market, 2 villages, over where a man can exchange a fleece for iron nails and a whetstone, a live piglet for a second-hand kettle, 12 eggs for a handful of salt, bright as frost. But the most complicated part of the exchange is invisible, reputation. A family that keeps its word is remembered. A boy who throws stones at geese instead of minding them is remembered too. A kingdom is 1,000 transactions like these, braided together, and a bell at the hour keeps their rhythm. Faith does not sit apart from this life. It threads through it like a warp through weft. A sprig of boxwood, cut and blessed on Palm Sunday, tucks into the beam above the door. A cross of last year's rushes rides high in the thatch. A whisper, barely a whisper, of scent. Scholastica's name accompanies a glance at the sky when the clouds have been hoarding rain too long. In the church, Mass flows in Latin, shaped by 1,000 mornings, and the words wash over people who cannot pass them but do not need to. The shape is what matters. The rise and fall, the kneeling and the standing. The moment when bread becomes more than bread and the hour marks itself upon the week. Outside, in the porch where people stand to talk because they still smell of cows, your neighbor asks if your sow has farrowed yet. And you say not yet. And both of you touch wood without thinking. Inside the farmhouse, the table is laid with a care that is part reverence, part custom. Salt stands in pride of place, a tiny white hill in a wooden trencher, and each person knows where to sit without being told. The household head carves meat on the rare days when there is meat at all. More often, there is pottage and bread baked that morning. The crust cracked in the good way that comes when the oven was not too hot and the dough was not too sulky. There is a hierarchy even in eating, but it is not always cruel. The best piece, when there is a best piece, can travel the length of the board like a little mercy. Afterward, the bowls are wiped with their own bread and set aside, because wood holds memory and must be handled cleanly. Evening returns at a pace that only seems quick when you have spent all the daylight you had. A rushlight sputters and steadies. The sheep have been counted into their pen. The sow turns her straw into a cradle, with the same push-push that mothers use to settle quilts. Someone cards wool by the fire, the fibres loosening into a small cloud that looks almost too soft to belong to the same earth that grows stones under every plough. There is talk of the Whitsun Fair, of a boat overturned on the river last week, and a man who swears he saw a swallow in February, which means nothing and everything. There is always weather to predict and promise to fold into the dark. When the bell speaks again, across the fields, Compline, the last of the day, the farm is already quiet. The ladder to the sleeping loft is narrow. A boy climbs it backward, hooting like an owl until a sister shushes him and laughs. The parents lie full length under wool and linen, and the smells of the day, smoke, damp earth, lanolin, barley, dog. If a worry wakes the head of the house, it is a worry he shares with every head of house, from Kent to the Welsh marches. Have we done enough? Will the seed take? Will the rent be met without borrowing from a cousin? Will the cough ease before it drops deeper into the chest? None of these questions have answers in the dark. So the night gives what it can, a steady roof, the slow soft thunder of cattle shifting in their stall, the idea that morning is dependable. Some empires begin with a drum. This one begins with a bell and a field. The kingdom, reawakened, is not the glitter of court or the purple of princes. It is the way the first furrow accepts its line. It is the way a woman's breath brings the coal to bloom. It is the way two quiet oxen lean forward together, and a boy, not yet tall enough to see over the gate without hopping, learns to listen for the moment when the ground stops singing underfoot and the work can truly begin. The bell does not argue. It announces, before the sky has quite decided on a colour. The first stroke travels outward from the monastery tower and lays a thin silver thread over the land. In choir, the monks lift their voices for matins and then lauds. Psalms stitched to the breath, the way furrows are stitched to the field. They will do this 7 more times before the day is done. Prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, compline, and once again at night, for the long vigil when most of the countryside sleeps. The hours are not a background to work. They are the frame that lets work be a picture at all. On the farm, the sound reaches like a sower's hand, and the household answers without thinking. No one stops mid-swing of the gate to fall on their knees. No one throws down a milking pail to sprint for church. Instead, there is a shorter breath, a quick sign scratched in the air, sometimes only a look toward the east, and the task continues. A woman cuts the last ragged tongue of flame from the rushlight and murmurs a Gloria as she sets the pot to boil. A boy, knee-deep in straw, whispers the Our Father for the sow's safe farrowing, because it is always possible that God likes to be asked. A man lifts the yoke onto the oxen, checks the leather with his thumbs, and says nothing at all, which is its own kind of prayer. Religion is not a room you go into once a week. It is the line of the lane, the shape of the day, the taste of the bread, and the reason for the bread's salt. On the high days, Sundays, and saints' feasts, the parish gathers, and the church becomes a ship, timber ribs in the roof, whitewashed walls, bright with painted saints, a light like water moving across the floor. The words are Latin and, for most, unpassable, but the choreography is as familiar as tying one's hose. Kneel at the confiteor. Rise at the gospel. Bow at the name no one dares to speak carelessly. Children watch their elders and make clumsy little crosses in the wrong place. And no one corrects them because good habits grow like hedges, better planted early, and better thick than perfect. After Mass, in the porch where the old carvings have had their noses rubbed away by centuries of fingers. Business resumes. A monk with a ledger and a clean, tired smile takes note of who has paid their rent in coin and who brings it in fleece or barley. Promises are recorded alongside deliveries. A kingdom runs on both. The abbot, when he rides the parish, is a small court on a small horse. He listens for petition and trouble the way an experienced shepherd listens for the different bleat in 100 normal voices. If a tenant has been laid low by a fever, leniency is possible. If a tenant has been laid low by his own ale, leniency is possible once. The monasteries economy land for rent, mills for toll, markets for exchange rests on something less countable, reputation and blessing. Every trade knows its patron. The ploughman may look to Saint Isidore and the sower to Saint Focus, the miller, whose hands are whitened by dust even at the feast, nods to Saint Nicholas, because a good wind is as miraculous as any gift. The sheep shearer has a soft spot for Saint Well, Blaise, whose throat miracle is a comfort when a lamb coughs out of season. And over all of them, patient and bookish, stands Saint Benedict, whose rule teaches that work and prayer are not two things but one word in 2 syllables. It is no surprise, then, that the men and women of this parish, practical as hayricks, form a guild, not a flashy conspiracy of goldsmiths or a fraternity of city drapers who could buy a bishop between them. A humbler company, stitched from hedgers and spinners, dairymen and wrights. They call themselves, with a mixture of audacity and tenderness, the Guild of Saint Benedict. They hire a clerk to draw up their names on vellum, each letter dark as a sown seed. The vellum is calfskin, thin and smooth and strangely alive beneath the quill. The ink bites without bleeding if the hand is calm. The scribe strips a goose feather of its vanities, cuts a nib with a knife that remembers other skins, and sets the words at a modest tilt across the page. Later, a painter will add a capital the B of Benedict, swelling with acanthus and berries, and in the curl of a leaf he will paint a tiny farmer carrying a rake, because artisans cannot resist jokes that only other artisans will ever see. The guild rents an altar in the north aisle and keeps it in candles. Not tallow those are for the farmhouse. guttering and sweetly rancid, but beeswax, whose flame is white and steady. Bees are holy in a plain old way. They labour, they make sweetness. They teach geometry to anyone who bothers to learn. In late spring, a monk with a broad-brimmed hat and a steadier nerve than most lifts skeplids and speaks softly while he works. The comb comes away heavy with honey and light with wax. And in the bakehouse yard, the two are separated by the simplest of technologies, heat and patience. The wax is cleaned and melted and dipped again until the candles hang like pale fruit from their wicks, ready to stand in ranks on the altar and throw their clear light over the book and the bread. Light matters. It matters in the late afternoon, when the sun finds the coloured saint on the wall and makes his cloak look briefly like silk. And it matters in the early morning of a winter's day, when the church is warmer than the fields, not because of any generosity of masonry, but because a space full of singing warms itself. The monks keep time by light. More or less, the foliot of the new big clock can be coaxed to run faster in the long summer day and slower in the shortenings of December, but even the metal heart of that machine beats in service to prayer. It rings the bell that rings the hour that rings the parish, and the parish rings itself like an answering bowl. Faith has practical edges. On Palm Sunday, willow and box are blessed and braided into small green crosses that dry to a brown faithfulness and ride out the year above doors and on bedposts. During Rogation Tide, the parish goes out in procession to beat the bounds, the priest in vestments with the cross at the head, choristers in surplices, everyone else in their Sunday best, which is just their working clothes, brushed free of straw. At each landmark oak, stone, stream the priest intones, a prayer for good weather, safe harvest, and justice on earth. And the boys are jostled and bounced, and sometimes whacked with a switch in a ritual. Everyone pretends is catechism, and no one pretends to enjoy. They will remember the tree afterward. And that is the point. Memory is a kind of fence. Between the feast days, devotion is domestic. Over the door of the farmhouse hangs a tiny painting of the Virgin so darkened by smoke that only the hands are clear, palms turned outward in their perpetual yes. A sprig of rue dries above the window where flies prefer to come. A medal from a pilgrimage to a nearer than it sounds, shrine is pinned to the inside of a cap. Old stories trickle down into household rules. Do not spin after sunset. Thread tangled in the night draws bad luck. Do not cut bread across the loaf. It is an insult to the cross that lives, invisibly, in the crumb. Do not name the fox. Do not count the eggs in front of the hen. Do not. Above all, talk about the weather as though you were in charge of it. But talk leads elsewhere, and properly so. When the barley begins to green and the peas hook their tendrils into the net of the air, the guild meets to discuss charity, because charity is a crop with its own calendar. A portion of every member's dues goes to an alms chest. A portion of that becomes candles for funerals and blankets for the winter poor. A portion of that becomes a small loan to a widow to buy a second goat. The book records the sums in a careful hand, and beside some entries there is a short red line, meaning the debt is forgiven because there are some burdens you do not allow to harden into obligations. If a sharecropper's cottage burns, the parish rebuilds it, and if there is a question about whether he was drunk when the fire leapt, the parish decides there is no question. There is superstition here. If by superstition we mean those narrow bridges people build where official roads have not yet been laid. A farmer sprinkles crumbs of blessed bread on a field 3 nights running after the deer have come like a tide. A mother knots 3 hairs from her child's head into the thatch and says the creed slowly backward because a midwife taught her that on a wet March night, when the river was closing over its banks, a shepherd carries a charm sewn into his jerkin, a scrap of parchment with a psalm on it and something older underneath, all of it fading together into the same brown. It cannot hurt, he says, and no one argues with a man who sleeps on hills. You could say, if you wanted to be clever, that faith is an economy. Gifts go up, blessings come down, sins are confessed and released like doves, obligations circulate among neighbours until they are transformed into something lighter than duty, heavier than preference. But the word economy feels thin in the mouth next to the taste of ale and bread and smoked bacon, next to wool, combings that cling to the knuckles and beeswax that keeps its honey scent even after the comb is melted. It is more accurate to say that faith is a weather, and like weather, it is made of small, invisible motions that add up to a sky. On bad days, it is low and grey and wants to spit. On good days, it opens and says yes to the distances. Most days, it is simply there, worn and large and present enough to work under. At night, when the last bell has been rung and the last ember arranged into a little hill that will be a convenience in the morning, the parish goes to sleep with its worries and its work and its waist-high hopes. Somewhere, a monk lifts his voice into darkness to keep the hours for all the sleepers who cannot keep them for themselves. He chants in a language that does not need to be understood to be useful, the same way a furrow does not need to know the name of the seed it holds. The words rise and repeat and fade, and out in the fields the oxen turn in their dreams, and a boy dreams of bells. Tomorrow, they will all begin again, because beginnings are the most faithful thing the world has ever learned to do. Begin with the ground, because the ground owns everything. A farm that looks tidy from the lane is, up close, a negotiation with mud. The lower field holds water after rain. The doorway wants a stone step or two to lift it clear of the splashback. The path between house and byre needs hazel brush, laid thick, then trampled into a springy mat that keeps boots from vanishing to the ankle. If the year is kind, you notice these things lazily. If the year is mean, you learn them by heart. Either way, you begin with what the land insists upon and build outward. Timber comes first. The coppice has been cut in its turn and answers gladly, as coppice always does, sending up straight. Obedient poles from stumps that look too old for hope. In a world where iron is dear and nails are to be argued with, wood that agrees to your plans is wealth. Hazel is the great conspirator, light in the hand, flexible when green, loyal when dry. You walk the cut with a man who knows it as a shepherd knows his flock. He shows you stools you may take from, stools you must leave, and where the stools gather close enough that 2 swipes of a billhook will make you feel like a lord. The air smells of sap and leaf mould, and a sweetness you will taste again, weeks hence, when you bend a green wand, and it bends back without breaking. The fence for pigs must be honest. Pigs have a university degree in escape, and they write new theses every spring. You drive a line of stakes oak if you have it. Chestnut, if the gods have smiled. Otherwise, whatever is straight and stubborn, then weave hazel between them. One wand in front, the next behind, and so on. A basket turned inside out and hammered into the earth. The weave tightens as it grows. The first course looks like a promise. The 5th, like a wall. The 12th, like a verdict. At the corners you lash diagonals with withy ties and thump the lower runs with the flat of an axe until the whole panel goes from echoing hollow to speaking solid. If a pig can shove his nose between two rods, he will. If he cannot, he will merely plan for tomorrow. So you add a dead hedge along the outside, thorn and bramble laid thick and cruel. The sort of language every animal reads. When the pen stands finished, you do not boast. You watch it the way you would watch a handsome stranger who has just joined your card game. The shelter that sits inside the pen is work of a gentler sort, and older. 4 uprights, 2 wall plates, a simple pitch to take the rain, and then the magic, wattle and daub. The wattle is the same weaving you used for the fence, but closer. The daub is a handful of the farm's biography clay dug from the path edge, chopped straw from last harvest, a little hog dung, because bacteria are engineers, and you should hire the best. You stamp it in a trough with your bare feet until it goes from polite to sticky. Then you plaster it on the wattle with open palms. Children love this work, which says something good about children and about civilization. The wall swallows your handprints and keeps them for 1,000 afternoons. If you smooth the outer skin with a wet broom, the way your grandmother taught you, the panel dries to a gentle shine, cloud grey or honey brown depending on the clay, and is warmer than stone in winter, cooler than stone in summer, and better than stone in every season at forgiving your mistakes. Roofs have opinions, and you are wise to listen. Thatch is not simply grass promoted, it is a system. You lay the first course, the eaves broad and generous, to throw water far from the wall, then climb upward in tidy steps, each new layer covering the heel of the last like overlapping scales. The reed or long straw finds you through barter or kindness. You cut your own pegs from hazel, and with a spar hook, you twist them into staples that bite the thatch to the batten. A good thatcher makes music, a shush when the bundle is dressed, a tuk-tuk when the mallet settles it. The finished roof is not flat because rain is not polite. It swells slightly, like a sleeping animal, and sheds weather with the same quiet skill. You crown it with a simple ridge, pin a fox bristle charm into the peak old nonsense, useful nonsense, and step down the ladder with legs that suddenly remember they tremble. The house itself is an argument won decades ago by carpenters who could lay out a frame with nothing but chalk lines and a head full of geometry. Your duty is stewardship, to keep joints tight, to grease pins that turn in incation, to replaster the panels that have cracked where the sun finds them fiercest. A timber frame teaches the right kind of humility. It flexes when the wind pushes. It forgives if the ground subsides a little. You do not call such a house fragile. You call it alive. Tools multiply because tasks do, and because a farmer's year is only as orderly as his hooks and edges. In the dim between door and hearth, there is a tool tree, a board pegged and notched, and on it hang the vocabulary of making adze, froe, draw knife, auger, spoon bit, beetle, wedges. Iron is not wasted on show. The froe splits shingles true, so the rain will run a straight line. The draw knife bites with a long shush that leaves a sheen finer than any sand could give. The beetle thumps in a slow, righteous meter that says you are doing something that needed doing. Across the room, a small hand loom leans idle for now, its heddles quiet but ready. The big frame in the neighbour's hall takes the long warps when winter lets thought sit for longer without being stolen by chores. You cannot furnish a farm with wood alone. There is clay for the oven mouth and the floor tiles in the dairy. Unglazed tiles drink water and quietly exhale, cool. the only sort of blessing you can afford in summer when milk is swift to sour. A dairy is engineering disguised as reverence, north and east windows for draught. A trickle of water in a shallow channel across the tiles. Shelves of beech that wipe sweet and will not splinter under a wet cloth. People talk about fire as though it were the oldest ally. You begin to suspect that cool is older. Live weight moves the world. Oxen get the plough. Men get the rest. But there is more to that than romance. The yoke must fit the team the way a good sentence fits the sense. No chafing. No waste. You bore the bows with an auger. Shave them smooth, where necks will speak to them all day. And fit the pins so a lad can drop them home without cursing. The plough's body, the stock needs repair where the share seats, a scarf joint tightened with a wedge. A cheek replaced and hooped. A small prayer muttered that the edge will find the line in spring instead of grabbing for every buried pebble. A farmer's pride is not in owning tools. It is in keeping them sharp and quiet. Tenancy turns craft into arithmetic. The abbot's steward comes, ledger like a small brown coffin under his arm, and inspects without swagger. He looks at the pig pen and says nothing, which is both compliment and warning. He asks about lambing, and you answer with numbers that are a bit drier than the truth. Because truth has a way of swelling with drama when it is about animals you have helped be born. Rents are due at Michaelmas coin or kind, and you do not like to owe. Coin leaks through a house as though mice can smell it. And kind, though honourable, ties you to the wider market's humours. Wool may fetch well. It may sulk. Barley may be promised. The promise may fall to rain. So you build in buffers, a second sow to farrow a month after the first. A row of peas behind the west hedge where the deer are slower to nose the shoots. A quiet agreement with a neighbour that you will lend hands for his haying in return for his team at your harvest. God helps those who help each other is not scripture. It is merely true. Not every build is a structure. Some are habits hardened into form. The woodhouse is in fact a series of heaps under a lean-to, sorted by species and moisture and destiny, faggots for the bake oven, billets for the hearth, long lengths for future tool handles, crooked limbs for future questions. The hedgerow is not merely a fence, but a nursery, hawthorn and blackthorn at the back, hazel and holly interlaced, dog rose threading through, all of it laid in the winter with a billhook, so the living stems knit into a green wall that cows respect and birds adore. The midden is a map of meals. You clear it with a fork and a look away from your own nose, and carry its honest reek to the fields that need feeding. To talk about sustainability here would be like praising a fish for swimming. You simply arrange your appetites so tomorrow is possible. People arrive as surely as sparrows. A joiner who smells of linseed and a hint of beer mends the big table and leaves you a handful of shavings that curl like fiddle music. A tinker stops for half a day and sets 3 pans to rights with small circles of metal whose edges catch the light like coins. A widow brings a boy thin with growth and asks if you can spare milk in exchange for his hands at lambing. You say yes and think, privately, that hunger has more kinds of honesty than truth. You measure a house not only by its beams but by the number of small bargains it can hold without cracking. You will fail at things and learn how to fail better. The first attempt at steam-bending hazel for a sheep-shearing bench is 2 hot straw catches. Panic follows, and the air smells like an apology. The second is too cold, good wood snapped where it should have flowed. The third is a compromise born of stubbornness, stones heated to a quiet redness, straw soaked. A little water poured slowly until the smoke turns from angry to thoughtful, and then the wood slides into a curve that feels like agreement. The bench you assemble from those arcs sits square, and a ewe will sit in it, too, grumbling but safe, while the shears make their quiet kiss along her flank. In the evening, when the day's building has left your fingers rimed with clay and your forearms ruled with pale lines of straw dust, you stand back and look. The pig shelter is a small thing, scarcely higher than your shoulder, but it throws a clean shadow. The fence you wove holds, and beyond it the garden fence hums with bees. And beyond that, the hedgerow pretends it has always been there. The yard is not tidy. Tidy is for drawing rooms and lies, but it is legible. A rake here, because rakes belong there. A bucket there, because that is where buckets must be if they are to be useful before you think to need them. The oxen blink, as if pleased to find the world improved by increments. Night falls like a verdict delivered kindly. The children ask if their handprints will still be in the wall when they are as tall as the doorway. You say yes, because either they will be or you will have weathered something worth talking about. The day's last job is small and consequential. You walk the fence once more, palms sliding across the top rail, eyes level with where a pig's mind would be. You listen for mischief. The pen is quiet. The sow settles. The stars, those old nail-heads in the roof of the world, show through a seam of cloud. Back inside, the house smells faintly of lime wash and bread and smoke. The three safest smells you know. You set the last mug by the hearth, push the last ember into a neat red hill, and think not for the first time that to build is merely to confess your hope in a durable way. Tomorrow there will be new arguments with weather and wood. Tonight the walls hold. Begin with the hour when the body would prefer to bargain. The bed is warm. The loft is a cave of wool and old breath. Outside, the air waits with wet hands. But the bell has spoken, and the fire has opinions. And resisting either is a hobby for richer people. Someone has already swung a leg out from under the blankets and found the ladder with their toes. Someone else has slid feet into yesterday's hose and laced the doublet without quite opening both eyes. In the dark, the room is a map built from memory, the hook with the pot chain, the trivet, the stool that is always in the wrong place until you kick it, and then it is suddenly in the right one. Fire-making is a craft you feel more than you see. Flint against steel, a skitter. A star and the tinder catches like a secret passed along the bench. Slow, cautious, then eager if you treat it kindly. A fist of brushwood. A couple of billets. The pot swung into its accustomed orbit. The smell is old tallow. Smoke. A thread of last night's cabbage warmed back to life, and the first sound is older, water being convinced to move. A rushlight, pinched into a split of green wood, gives a small flame that pretends to be modest while blackening everything within a handspan. Its light is not enough for vanity, but more than enough to count bowls and find the salt. There is a ceremonial quality to the morning that no one calls ceremonial. A girl checks the bucket hoops and goes to the well. A boy, flat-footed with sleep, leans his weight into the door and coaxes it open against the remembered swell of last week's rain. The dairy woman slips the key from its peg and opens the cool room, where the tiles sweat politely and the air moves like a thoughtful person. From the yard comes the slow complaint of the byre hinge, and then the comforting bury breath of cattle, considering whether to wake or continue their philosophical refusal. Oxen are patient if you ask for patience, and stubborn if you ask for speed. They come to the yoke with the sleep still in their eyes, and the yoke greets them like an old friend who expects conversation in complete sentences. Leather creaks. A hand runs the line of each bow where necks will press all day. A man checks the ploughshare with a thumbnail, feels for a burr he does not want to introduce to the soil, and touches the wedge that holds the angle he argued into being yesterday afternoon. If the frost has lifted and the ground gives without sulking, he will aim for the lower field and the long pull beneath the ash. If not, there is ditching to be done, because water will have its way unless you teach it new manners. The smaller stock have their own calendar. Hens are political animals and insist on a separate breakfast before they will speak kindly about the day's work. A handful of grain broadcast with a sower's flourish. A word to the rooster who is growing too eager and needs a reminder that authority and generosity are meant to hold hands. In the sty, the sow heaves herself upright and snorts because you have disturbed a dream in which she was already eating. The piglets arrive at the trough like a prayer answered all at once. They are learning the fence nose. Think, give up while you are learning the same lesson about your own limits. The lanes wake more slowly than the hearth. A cart creaks somewhere beyond the hedgerow. Crows hold a parliament on the field oak and reach the same conclusion they reached yesterday. If the season permits it, you go to the barley with a bag tied across your chest. Sowing by hand is an act that looks like generosity and is, in fact, discipline. Left foot forward, right arm across, a soft arc, and the mind counting without spectacle, so the seed falls more or less evenly, instead of gathering in a fat boast at the edge of the field. You speak to the land without words, and the land answers by refusing to answer yet. Later, we will see. Do not get proud. Back at the house, the main meal is gathering itself. 11 in the forenoon is not a deadline. It is a peace treaty. Bread today, a darker loaf. A mix of wheat and barley comes from the bake oven, with a crust that sings if you press it to your ear. The pottage remembers, last night kindly, beans improved by leeks. A slice of veal if the season allows. Or a twist of last year's salted mutton, rinsed and coaxed back toward forgiving. The salt stands where salt stands. The table is laid without flourish. And yet the small ceremonies add up to dignity, the head of the house dividing a loaf, the youngest being given the first spoonful, because all of us are in debt to those who will outlive us. Ale is not luxury, and it is not vice. It is the way you decline to drink the well. The brew for daytime is small tamarisk of alcohol, big on safety, and carries the ghost of honey and straw. You drink it the way you breathe, often and without boasting. When the buckets are filled from the butt in the buttery, you note the foam and make the quick decision whether the yeast needs feeding or scolding. On brew day, the house is a ship, malt soaking and steaming, the copper muttering to itself, the air suddenly grown muscular with sweet. The spent grain is a currency in its own right. Pigs adore it, and nothing need be thrown away, except the bad idea of doing two things at once during the boil. Afternoons spill into the work that will be invisible by winter if you do it well now. In spring and summer, weeding, hedging, mending gates, cutting turfs to edge the path so your mud stays where you promised it would. In autumn, lifting potatoes, when the century gets that far, pulling beets, stacking faggots for the bake oven, and making sure the north wall gets its portion of limewash before the wet begins to lecture. In winter, everything that feeds on patience, carding, spinning, splicing, sharpening, laying the hedge while its sap is asleep, weaving new hurdles before the ewe, with the sideways eye, decides that the old gap is still a gap. The loom stands like a quiet judge in the corner, and, when time is merciful, agrees to let you throw a shuttle for an hour. The rhythm of treadles and the slap of the reed turn thought into cloth, and cloth into future. Clothes deserve an honesty we rarely grant them. The hose itch if they are not combed properly when the wool was still at the lock. Laces behave only when their holes are well set. And the codpiece, which seems a joke to those who have never knelt quickly in a field, is a practical door in a world that prefers buttons to grace. Women layer linen like calm. Men trust their doublets to carry the day's demands without fraying the seams where mind meets temper. Everything can be mended if you refuse to be proud and if the needle knows its business. Shoes fail in the same 3 places they have always failed. Saving for the cobbler is a discipline disguised as thrift. Some hours are for the well. There are days when the old wheel is idle and you draw by rope, hand over hand, your shoulders acknowledging that water is heavier than it looks. There are days when a borrowed treadwheel crane hoists 2 buckets at once and makes you feel like an engineer with a secret. Either way, you learn the sound of water returning to light. If you must cross the yard with a full yoke, you remember balance is not a posture, but a verb. Children believe they can do it easily until they try. Adults believe it is impossible until they remember they began as children. If you are lucky, work invites another kind of work. Milk warm from the cow goes to the dairy. Rennet persuades it into curds. A clean cloth and a patient hand press it toward the future. You salt the young cheese the way you would salt advice firmly, evenly, with love, and set it on the beach shelf, where the air is cool enough to be counted as family. Wool leaves the sheep and becomes, by stages, something humans can live with, washed in many waters, beaten by many hands, teased into cloud, taught to twist. The great wheel asks you to walk backward 30 miles in a day and promises a thread the thickness of a field's edge in return. It keeps its promise, and you keep yours. Not all bargains are symmetrical. Both parties can still be satisfied. Evening is the hour of mending, and of stories that do not admit they are stories. A man scraping the day's mud from his clogs tells about the time his father laid a hedge so tight a wren could walk it without showing her comb. A woman setting warp over the lease rods remarks, almost to the lintel, that geese used to be better mothers. A child counts freckles and pretends to confuse Orion with a shepherd carrying 2 lambs and a loaf. The rushlight dwindles. Someone trims it with a thumbnail, and the room seems to sigh with gratitude. Outside, a fox discusses philosophy with the hens. The dog returns the standard argument. Both retire with dignity. Fatigue, when it comes, is not an enemy. It is evidence. Your hands are a transcript of what happened, a stripe of straw cut here, a tarry crescent of pitch there, a small, proud blister raised by a tool you are learning to love. There are aches that teach you to change your stance. There are aches that teach you to let the lad take the next bundle, because he will be a man sooner than either of you expect. The worst tiredness, the fretful, aimless kind, belongs to seasons of uncertainty. When the sky takes the weak hostage, and the barley sulks, and the sow returns to the boar without explanation. Then the bell is a mercy. It tells you to stop envying the weather and go to bed. The last acts of the day are small courtesies. Bank the fire, so it will remember you in the morning. Turn the cheese. Lay the broom across the threshold, so mice will think twice. Tip the bucket, so it will not collect a skin of ice that lies to you at dawn. Check the sty, because pigs admire your work and will test it if you forget to admire it yourself. Lay out the adze and draw knife, not because you are tidy in your soul, but because tomorrow's version of you will be mean with sleep and grateful that today's version had manners. When Compline folds the countryside under its wing, the house agrees. The loft gathers feet. The blanket becomes a treaty. The last whisper is about weather, and the second to last about saints. Before sleep closes the ledger, you take a quick account, a furrow held straight, a hinge mended, a fence walked and found sufficient, a loaf that rose as if it meant it. The sums will never balance, not perfectly, but they will tilt toward survival if you keep showing up. And you will keep showing up, because the seasons do not ask for brilliance. They ask for attendance. Tomorrow, you will answer by name. Spring is a soft argument with certainty. The earth has loosened its frostbitten fist and opened to a dark, promising damp, but it still remembers how to take things back. A week of mild wind tricks primroses into showing their yellow coins along the hedge. A single night's spite draws its finger across the trough and leaves a sheet of ice thin as a lie. You plan anyway. You must. The sacks are lifted from the loft. The seed is checked for weevils. The bag that will ride across the sower's shoulder is looked over like a harness. Stitched places, thumbed, weak places strengthened. When the field drinks boot prints without complaint, when the clod breaks in the hand and keeps a little shape but not too much, it is time to speak to the soil in the language it respects. Sowing by hand is the oldest grammar the farm knows. A lad tries it first and makes a mess his arm too wild, his stride uncertain, and laughs because laughter is cheaper than pride. Then an older hand shows the way, weight on the left foot, right arm crossing the body, open palm, a calm arc, seed falling in a soft rain as regular as breathing. The bag rides the hip and is fed from the left hand, fingers measuring without counting, the way a singer finds a note she has sung all her life. A rook watches from the oak with the professional attention of a tacksman. You keep your line. You do not chase the bird. You chase an evenness the eye can only half see. When a stone catches your toe, you do not curse. You note there will be stones to gather after the harrow has done its teeth work. The field is divided by long, invisible sentences, one breadth of your stride married to one length of your arm, and by day's end the whole story lies behind you, glittering faintly with the husk of promise. Not all seed deserves the same handshake. Peas good. Meek peas want to be tucked in a little. You sow them thicker along the rows near the thorn hedge, a small gamble against deer who cannot resist the first sweet shoots of anything. Lentils and beans, if you have them, prefer to be buried deeper than barley. Barley itself is a cheerful fellow and will sprout from indifference as often as from care. But even barley benefits from respect. A bush harrow bunches of thorn lashed to a frame, skates across the field behind the oxen and pushes the seed into cover, where the ground is too claggy for the bush. A rake and patience do what patience always does. At the edges, where the strip gives way to a neighbour's claim, you are careful to go neither an inch too far nor an inch too short, because boundary quarrels breed faster than rabbits and live longer than hedges. In the corner of the field, a boy drives a clapper, and the rooks rise as if the earth has exhaled birds. The calendar does not hang on a wall. It hangs in the chest. Shrovetide comes like a confession bell rolling down the lane. The priest sits in the cold light of the nave and hears the parish unburden itself in ordinary voices. Sins are domestic, too much ale and too little patience. A hand too quick or a word too sharp, and forgiveness is domestic. 2. A penance measured in prayers you can say while your feet are in the furrow. In the kitchen, Shrove Tuesday's pan hisses with fat one last time before the fast begins, and a child laughs at the flip that fails and the second flip that flies right. Ash Wednesday dims the cheer with its thumbprint cross and its reminder that bodies are as mortal as candles. The Alleluias are folded up and put away like summer shirts. 40 leaner days follow, and you learn again how to want without sulking. Lent is not only a rule, it is an education. Meat is out of the question, for most. So are dairy and eggs, unless a bishop's permission or an old habit smudges the line. Fish and pulse step forward to fill the plate, salted herring resurrected in clean water, eels from the river's slow elbow, peas boiled until they agree to be agreeable, onions softened to sweetness, leeks coaxed until their green stops arguing. In the hedgerow, the first nettles are picked with a quick, clever hand pinch from under, where the sting is slow and turned into soup so green it looks like spring caught in a bowl. Alexanders push up along old walls, and their stems, peeled and cut, bring a dignified bitterness to the pottage, the kind of taste adults learn to call virtue. A woman keeps a small jar of almond meal for the high days, milked out to a fine white that pretends to be cow and fools no one but satisfies everyone. The fast empties the larder. The fields promise to fill it. Between the two, a household refines its appetite into gratitude. The church walks out to meet the fields in rogation tide, because boundaries must be learned with feet and prayer, not ink alone. The cross goes first, and the banner, and the small choir with their hems held up away from the mud. And then the parish, farmers in their Sunday hose patched neat, wives with shawls pinned tight against a wind that has not yet convinced itself to be warm, boys who are too old to be whacked and too young not to deserve it. At each mark the big ash by the stile, the stone that looks like a bishop, if the light is kind, the stream that muddles the parish line with its spring mischief, the priest chants his petition for fair weather and honest dealing, and the people answer as they have always answered, somewhere between hope and habit. A lad is held upside down at the far boundary because someone's grandfather was held upside down there and swore he never forgot it. The psalm is sung a bit stronger after that because laughter is a cousin to faith. Easter is not a single day. It is a way of being that slowly recolours the world. The paschal fire is kindled in the churchyard at night, and the new candle beeswax, clean and steady, takes its flame and becomes a column of light taller than any man. That candle stands like a spine in the chancel and reminds the parish that mornings were invented by someone with manners. On Easter morning, the Alleluias are unpacked. The bells shake the sparrows from the eaves. Eggs, hoarded during the fast or begged from a neighbour with a soft heart and generous hens, are blessed and boiled and shared. If there is a piece of lamb, it tastes like the future. If there is not, bread with honey is the right kind of feast. The bees having written their own homily in the comb. The first Monday after, work resumes with a cheerfulness that does not need to pass a test. While the church tends souls, the seed tends itself, which is not to say it is unguarded. There are spells of cold that burn like a kept grudge. There are hailstones like a handful of white peas thrown by a careless giant. There are days of warm rain that make you think you have been forgiven for everything, and nights of sly frost that make you think forgiveness has conditions you did not read carefully enough. A scarecrow is raised an old tunic, stuffed and mounted on a stake, and soon learns the limits of his charisma. Clappers speak, and the rooks learn the hours they can ignore them. A boy strings goose quills on a line, and the wind makes them titter their warning edge. You walk the field and look for the first green stitches of barley, and feel, against your better judgment, a temptation to count before counting is proper. You do not pull the young plant to see if it has rooted. You are not a fool. You kneel and press 2 fingers to the soil and find, in the cold, a complete sentence you cannot yet read. Old books kept at the monastery, written by men who had the leisure to notice say things worth hearing. Do not sow on a field that carries last year's temper. Let the fallow breathe. Put legumes where corn has been, because peas give the ground back something it lost, loving you. The monks do not call it fixing nitrogen. They call it prudence. You call it a pattern that works, the way a seam that never splits becomes a law in a tailor's shop. The open fields, the great quilt of strips run together and parcelled by custom teach, patience and neighbourliness with the same slow voice. You cannot take your harrow across your neighbour's plot because he finishes later. You cannot delay your sowing because he finishes earlier. You wait and move together and curse without heat. When a wheel bites into the turnwalk and leaves a rut you will both remember come harvest. The hungry gap is a phrase with teeth. Last year's stores have dwindled to jokes and corners, a carrot with the personality of a stick, a cabbage that has considered becoming philosophy, a bowl of beans that pretend they were always meant to be hard. Milk, if the cows are calved, blesses the table and then breaks your heart when Lent forbids it. Some rules are bent by necessity, and some are obeyed because obedience has its own flavour. You learn the edible weeds the way a scribe learns, abbreviations, ground elder, before it tastes of shoe leather. Sorrel, bright as a coin. Goosegrass, if you are willing to chew. Violets, because they make the bowl look like mercy. A pot sweetened with the first rhubarb, when the century permits, restores the future to the present. The hungry gap is not only about bellies. It is about patience. Soon the nettles become rope and the peas learn to climb a string, and you will forget how long waiting can be. In among all this caution, there are moments of straightforward gladness. Lambing, for one, which takes the night by the collar and makes it earn its keep. A ewe who needed help last year manages alone this time and looks smug about it. Another requires 2 hands and a breath held for longer than is comfortable. And then the world starts again, as if it had always planned to. A hen goes broody in the hayloft and must be moved at dusk, both for her safety and for the sake of temper in the household. Children are sworn to silence and manage it for 3 heartbeats at a time. The first swallow cuts a black curve against a washed blue sky, and a man who claims not to hold with signs holds his breath anyway. By mid-spring, the field is a summary of so many small decisions that it feels like a conscience. You walk the headland and see the barley writing itself in a hand you recognize. You note where the peas have taken and where they sulk, and decide whether the fault is yours or the saints, and whether it matters which. The guild meets after Vespers and agrees to set aside money for candles against a wet harvest, because there is nothing so dark as a barn in October when the sky is churlish and the threshing must be done by faith as much as by flail. A name is read out. A widow who needs help to fence her strip. 3 men look at their hands and say they will come on Tuesday if Tuesday is sober. It will be. When the bell rings for Compline, the farm is quiet in the new way spring brings, not the sulky silence of winter, but the attentive hush of something growing while you sleep. The sow dreams. Perhaps, of acorns and gets only chaff. The oxen breathe a slow tide. The children arrange themselves into improbable knots and, for once, do not kick in their dreams. You bank the fire and lay your hand, briefly, on the seed bag hanging from its peg. It is lighter now, and that is both loss and hope. In the morning, you will go to the field again, to see whether the soil has answered your careful question with the only answer that matters, yes. In time. Craft is what a household does when the fields can spare its hands. It is not a hobby in the sense a lord uses the word, something to pass an idle hour. It is the second harvest, gathered from fire and fibre, from fat and ash, from the stubbornness of metal and the willingness of wood. When the weather narrows, the list of outdoor commands, the rooms grow articulate. Every corner develops a voice, and each voice says the same thing in a different accent. Begin with wool, because the sheep have been faithful. The fleece comes off in a single practiced peel, a winter's coat turned inside out and persuaded to be summer. It looks, at first, like a problem. Dirt and lanolin and whatever adventures a sheep had in the gorse cling to the locks. The smell is the smell of the hill brought indoors. But hot water and soft hands are a grammar as old as patience. The fleece is skirted, the worst edges sent to the garden for mulching, the rest washed, not boiled, never boiled, unless you want felt before its time and dried in wind that knows its business. Then come the cards, 2 paddles bristling with wire teeth. They tame the locks into little clouds that carry the memory of the sheep like a story told in a low voice. Spinning is a negotiation between gravity and stubbornness. The great wheel hums. The spinner walks backward, as if retreat were the best way to make progress, drawing the fibre out into a long, soft possibility and letting twist creep along the draft until fibre remembers. It is supposed to be thread. A spindle collects the world in a spiral. The first thread is thick as appetite. The second is finer. By the third afternoon, the fingers learn where to press and where to yield. And the wheel and the hand and the mind agree on a narrow road that does not waver. 2 threads are plied together over a bowl of water that keeps them honest. The result is yarn that knows what it wants to be next. The loom waits like a measured promise. Warping is architecture, pegs set, threads counted, a cross preserved at all costs, so the order will not tangle into grievance. Heddles are threaded with the care you would give to teeth if you expected to be judged on your smile. The first throw of the shuttle is a courtesy. The second is a treaty. By the 20th, the room has acquired a metronome treadle. Shed, pick, beat, and anyone who tries to speak must learn to fit their sentences into the rests. Cloth grows not by spectacle but by miles. On dye days, vats sing a different key. Woad gives a blue pulled up from the ribcage of leaves and left to bloom in air like a secret telling itself. Madder brings a red with iron in its bones. Weld and broom and onion skins lend yellows that look like bottled weather. Nothing is entirely predictable, which is why it is worth doing. A cloak the colour of the monastery's shadow is as much an achievement as a furrow straight as a hymn. Wool has an afterlife in water and rhythm. The woven cloth is fulled, cleansed and tightened into honour first by feet in a tub, and later, when God's generosity is harnessed by gearwork, by fulling hammers driven by the millstream. The sound carries down the lane. A wooden heartbeat that tells a village its cloth is becoming serious. Afterward, the wet web is stretched on tenter frames in the meadow. held by hooks, whose very name will become a proverb. Between heaven and ground. The cloth dries to its measure, wind combing it the way a mother's fingers comb a child's hair after a bath. The first time you see a field of cloth like that, you understand why merchants count towns by their textiles, and why a storm at the wrong hour can turn a month's labour into regret. Not everything is soft. Fire wants a say. In the yard, the smith's portable hearth stands on 3 legs like a sensible beast. A bellows coughs, then breathes, then turns the charcoals red to a white that means business. Iron, sullen when cold, becomes a negotiable instrument in that light. A hinge leaf thins under the hammer's square persuasion. A hook draws out and curls like a cat settling on a warm stone. A share edge takes temper in a trough of water. It's hard where it must cut, and not so hard it will shatter. Sparks write their brief alphabet against the dark, and then forget it. This is not grand forgery, with wide-armed swinging and showers of heroic fire. It is the quiet making of the parts a farm consumes like bread. In another corner of the world, metal is a hymn. Bell metal is a stern alloy high-tin bronze, hard, bright, unforgiving, and it demands courtesies other metals will not ask. The monastery's bell founder has come to the outbuildings that lie just far enough from the cloister to let a furnace announce itself without scandal. A pit is dug, a core moulded from clay and straw, a false bell shaped in wax, an outer mould laid over that. The wax is melted out, lost. They call it, though nothing is truly lost when form is the point, and copper and tin, persuaded by blast and bellows, pour in like daylight made liquid. Days later, the mould breaks, and a bell comes to light, with a voice it does not yet know it owns. The first strike with a clapper is always a moment of held breath. When the note blooms and stands, people smile who did not think bells could make them smile. When the clockwork in the tower takes that note and arranges it into hours, the parish has been given a spine. Clockwork itself is a recent kind of courage. The verge and foliot do not keep time so much as domesticate it. A weight falls, and in falling urges a train of wheels. The verge interrupts, the foliot argues, and the result is not accuracy. Summer speeds it. Winter slows it, but regularity enough to knit prayer and plough into a shared braid. It is a defiance that does not feel like arrogance. The hours were always there. The clock merely teaches them to speak on cue. When the bell rings, sext. A boy knows how much thread he ought to have on his spindle. When it rings, vespers. A woman knows how many cheeses she can turn before the light is squandered. Speaking of cheese, the dairy is an instrument tuned to a narrow band of clean. Milk arrives warm and slightly grassy, the breath of the cow still on it. It is poured through cloth into shallow pans to let the cream rise. Then rennet borrowed from a calf's first stomach. A grim kindness persuades the milk to become curd. Curds are cut with a long knife in crosshatch, then stirred with a flat ladle until they give up way, like a child giving up a toy. Salt goes in measured, not by flourish, but by the weight of experience, and the curds are hooped and pressed. First, gently. Then, with a stone that understands loyalty. On the beach shelves, the rounds are turned day after day until their skins dry to a dignity. When a cheese opens under the knife 6 weeks later and smells like a good argument concluded, the whole house is grateful to its own discipline. Light is both tool and theology. Tallow candles are democracy at its messiest cheap, smoky, necessary, and the long, careful dipping of wicks produces a harvest of imperfect soldiers that gutter in drafts and still manage to serve. Beeswax is a different class, cleaner, brighter, with a scent that remembers flowers, reserved for altars and midwives, and the odd feast that wishes to feel like a holy day. Then there is the rushlight, the poor man's candle, a strip of marsh-grown pith dried and run through a bath of fat, hung from a clip that angles the flame to cheat the law of consumption, giving light enough to keep fingers from misunderstanding themselves. On nights when the wind stones the panes with rain, a house lit by rush and tallow feels like a boat, the family a crew, the work a voyage. Soap is a triumph of unpleasantness in service of grace. Ashes poured over water make lye strong enough to argue with grease. Tallow meets it, complains, and surrenders. The result cures to bars that remember the quarrel but do not keep it alive. Hands that have known sheep and pigs and plough handles deserve that small courtly moment at day's end when the dirt releases them and the skin says, "Thank you," without words. Leather, too, comes grudgingly into usefulness, oak bark tanned until it closes like a well-made fist, then dressed with fat and elbow until it will take a stitch and keep it. The cobbler speaks to shoes where they fail and persuades them to fail elsewhere for a while. Coopers and wheelwrights visit like weather, not often, not never, and always with a smell about them that makes a yard interested. A cooper bends staves with steam and wit, drives hoops with a hammer that has learned 40 ways to be gentle, and leaves behind a cask that does not leak when ale suggests it should. A wheelwright, part geometer and part prophet, sets an elm hub, fits spokes, shrinks a red-hot tire of iron onto the rim, and quenches it into place with a hiss that makes children cheer. Both men carry the kind of confidence that grows from mastering, shapes the rest of us, only borrow. The brewhouse, which is also the kitchen and sometimes the nursery, because rooms do whatever is asked of them, has its own liturgy. Malt is soaked, then spread and turned until it sprouts just enough to wake its sweetness. The kiln arrests it there, neither green nor burned. The mash tun receives it with hot water and extracts the sugars. The copper receives that and boils it with a handful of herbs hops when they are available, and the century obliges. Grew it when it is not, while steam makes a cathedral of the rafters. Yeast is borrowed from yesterday's happiness and returned fuller tomorrow. The ale for daily use is small and honest. The ale for feast days has opinions and requires a stronger hand with the tap. Throughout all of it, the division of labour is not the division of worth. Women carry the household's second economy in their wrists and shoulders: brewing, baking, spinning, weaving, dairying, medicine that smells of rosemary and vinegar and works often enough to be kept. Men carry weight and iron and wood and the long fields that ask for their backs. The lines are clear until they are not. A woman at the anvil is still a woman. A man at the churn is still a man. And both are forgiven their trespass when the task is urgent and the result useful. Children are apprentices to everything. They learn danger by nicking themselves and measure by missing the measure, and the house holds them while they do. Evening gathers the crafts into a single room, the way a river gathers tributaries. A length of cloth dries on the line near the hearth. A bell clapper waits on a stool, oiled and wrapped like a baby. A hoop leans against the settle, still warm from its fitting. A row of small cheeses sweats, its first brave salt. The air is thick with nouns that began the morning as verbs. Talk is soft because the hands are still busy. Someone hums the monotone of a psalm without noticing. Someone else counts stitches and loses the number and does not mind. The bell in the tower reads out the hour. And for once, you think, with a gratitude that includes metal and monks and men you will never meet, how pleasant it is to be told when to stop. Soon there will be feasts again, music, banners, benches dragged out into the sun, and the things made quietly in winter will go outdoors to tell the world what the household has been up to. A new cart that does not quarrel with ruts. A cloak that takes the wind like an equal. A bell whose voice makes the sky behave. But for now, the room is bright enough. And the craft is its own celebration. A way of saying to the year, we intend to stay. Whitsun arrives like a window thrown open. After the fasts and the careful reckonings of spring, the village loosens its jaw and remembers how to sing. The Sunday itself carries the weight of church white garments. The story of wind and flame told again, so everyone can try on courage. But Whitsun Monday belongs to the people. Benches are dragged from porches to the green. Trestles are hammered together under trees that have finally decided to mean it about leaves. A barrel appears as if the earth grew it. And someone who swore only last week to drink with prudence draws the first foaming proofs of human weakness and forgiveness. Morris men tie on bells that have been sulking in a chest since Candlemas and stamp the year awake. Sticks meet in the air with a clack that sounds like scythes agreeing to be friends. Handkerchiefs flutter like small, white shouts. A fool in motley grins his way through the steps and collects a chicken and 3 eggs in a hat, already full of laughter. Children orbit the dancers with the solemn intensity of smaller moons. The musicians pipe and tabor, a wheeze of bag. Perhaps a fiddle, if the century smiles fall into a tune that knows how to measure bodies without chafing them. The steps are not learned so much as recognized. A man who has not danced since last September finds the pattern waiting in his bones like an old psalm. Food travels outward from kitchens and bakehouses the way summer travels across a field, steadily, with purpose, willing to be admired. Bread is the first and last word on the table, as always, but today there is a loaf or two of fine white for the parish officers and the abbot's steward if he chooses to honour the green with his presence. The rest of us tear brown bread that tastes of honest grain and the oven's dark blessing. There is roast mutton, if the flock has been kind, a spit of hens, if the fox has been less successful than he boasted all winter, a pie with more turnip than goose, and no one minding. Ale sits in jugs, small beer in a tub for those who will still have to stand up and walk a straight line after sunset. Cheese opens like a good argument and finishes like a handshake. Someone's aunt produces a jar of pickled something and tells the story of how it nearly failed and then decided not to. The story improves the taste. Feast is not only eating, it is ranking without rancour. The steward, if he comes, gets the best bench and the seat with a view. The reeve sits near enough to talk rent if he must, and far enough to pretend he will not. The priest blesses the board and takes the second slice, neither humble nor proud. Old men who survived winters when bread was a rumour sit where their knees can stretch. Women who remember birth and death as neighbouring houses find the shade that matches their patience. Children occupy every gap, because gaps are what children are for. The poor are not forgotten today, not out of theory, but out of habit. A plate passes and comes back lighter, and someone mutters that God sees what is done in the open better than what is done in the dark, which is the opposite of most people but just right for God. At the edge of the green a maypole wears its ribbons, like weather. Not every parish keeps the pole. Not every priest loves it. But where it stands, it draws the year into a chord. Hands take cloth blue, red, yellow, green, and step in and out with a care that admits laughter, and still produces a braid the eye enjoys untying. The dance is less courtship than rehearsal for it, the mutual regard, the shared near misses, the trust that feet will appear where feet are needed. When the pattern collapses and the ribbons tangle, there is a flurry of good-humoured penitence, and the world goes on. Midsummer has a different heat. The days are wide then, stretched like linen on tenterhooks, and evening takes her time. Fires are lit on the hilltops in honour of St. John, though no one quite agrees whether the flames keep away witchcraft or only the sense that time slides downhill faster after June. The young leap, the embers one by one low first, then higher as bravery or showing off suggests, and a pair of sweethearts jump together to learn what they already know. Herbs gathered that morning hang in doorways. A sprig of mugwort, tucked into a shoe, pretends to lengthen the walker's life and at least improves the smell of the walk. The moon that follows a midsummer fire seems to have been practicing for weeks. When it clears the rise, somebody begins a song that has only 2 notes and 100 verses, and everyone joins as best they can. Between the named days, the parish invents reasons to eat together. A church ale raises money for the roof or the poor, or a bell rope no one else will pay for. An ox roast celebrates the repair of a bridge that kept forgetting its purpose. A visit from a patron saint's relic gives the innkeeper permission to burn through a cask with clean conscience. These gatherings are not subversive. They are the community reminding itself of its own weight. Work likes to say it is the foundation of life, and it is. But feast is the mortar that keeps the stones from rattling when carts go by. The holy days carry their own choreography of kindness. On the feast of a parish's patron, the procession goes out with a flourish of banners dyed in colours that once lived inside plants and now live inside cloth. Saints look down from their niches with the calm of people who have seen better and worse. The bell rings not only the hour but the rumour of pleasure, and even the sternest faces soften at its second stroke. The Guild of St. Benedict, proud of their beeswax and their tidy accounts, supply candles tall enough to impress neighbours and honest enough to burn cleanly. The nave smells of rushes newly strewn and of bodies that have earned their sweat. When the host is raised, caps come off, eyes come down. Silence lifts like a bird and glides the whole length of the church. Harvest home, when it comes, is a feast with mud on its boots, and no one minds the mud. The last sheaf dressed up as a maiden if the year wants to flirt. As a man, if it wants to boast, rides a wagon like a small queen. The reapers follow, sore as saints and happier, with the rhythm of the sickle still clipping through their wrists, even while their fingers hold a cup. The first loaf from the new grain is blessed. The knife that cuts it remembers every blade that cut every stalk. A jug circles faster than news. Someone sings a threshing song in harvest time, a nonsense chorus with a wicked verse, and the priest laughs into his sleeve because priests are citizens where they live. If there is cider, it tastes like the orchard, keeping a secret and failing. None of this is simple innocence. A feast can go wrong. The ale turns sour if a careless fly finds the vat. And so can a crowd if the old grudge wakes and stretches and asks to be fed. A fool's mockery can bite through hide. A dance can step on a toe that belongs to the wrong temper. But the village is practised at pulling its day back from the brink. A woman with a tongue as sharp as a bodkin draws attention away with a story. The reeve reminds a pair of hot lads that their fathers are watching. And the lads remember they wanted to be worth watching. The bell is there if needed. A cool sound poured over heat, and the cool takes. By lamplight, the feast dwindles to its true size. Bones are gathered for broth. Crusts are carried to quiet mouths. Benches are shouldered home. The fool sits on his own overturned bucket and looks thoughtful, which is the best trick any fool ever learns. Morris bells come off one by one. The ribbon knots are teased apart. The maypole leans a little from the day's affection and straightens overnight, like a man who pretends he is not stiff. The green looks larger in the dim, as places do when they have been properly used. In the houses, the simple luxury of washing a face with warm water feels like another course of the feast. If you listen in that hour, you can hear the way celebration rewires a place. The road to the church has acquired a memory of feet. The field path has learned a new verse. The air by the inn door keeps a warm pocket for laughter. Tomorrow, hand and back will go back to their bargains with the hedge and the plough and the pig with a doctorate in mischief. Tomorrow's list is already written. Mend the rake tine. Set the seine for eels. See if the brew wants more malt or more mercy. But tonight the parish has told itself a story in bread and ale and tune. And the story ends, as most honest stories do, with gratitude. Somewhere beyond the dark hedges, other stories are turning royal policies and monastic rumours, talk of lands and laws loosening from their old bindings. The bell, untroubled, keeps the hour. The village yawns, blows out its candles, and trusts that what has been braided today, work, prayer, and the clean riot of feast will hold when the wind freshens. For now, the green sleeps. For now, that is enough. History does not change its clothes in a single morning. It begins by loosening a stitch, a rumour, first harmless as a feather on a windowsill, then a letter carried in a leather bag, then a proclamation read in a square by a man who has practised sounding taller than he is. Monasteries, it is said, are to be visited, their houses reformed, their goods surveyed. The words are tidy. The work behind them is not. By the time the bell in our parish tower learns what the court intends, the court has already decided that the bell and the tower belong to the king. At first, the change arrives like bad weather far off. A pedlar repeats what he heard at the last market town, a book in the king's English, psalms without Latin, a marriage for the king that requires him to wriggle free of a pope's hand. The abbot frowns and keeps his voice even. The steward sets his jaw and keeps his accounts immaculate. The Guild of St. Hay, Benedict trims its candles as usual and chooses not to count how many days their light still belongs to them. The parish sober people, with dirt under their nails and little patience for courtly grammar, keep sowing peas. Then the visitors ride in, and the world moves 2 inches to the left. They are not many, a clerk with an ink-hungry pen, a gentleman whose hat arrives before he does, 2 men whose hands know how to fold documents and fists with equal fluency. Their questions are brisk. How many acres in demesne? What rents in coin? What in kind? How many sheep? How many bells? A novice sneezes in a draught. The clerk does not look up. The visitors walk the cloister and the bakehouse, the orchard and the tithe barn, ticking inventories that turn rooms into numbers and numbers into something portable. No one is rude. No one is kind. What dissolves a monastery is not acid or fire. It is signatures. The seal bites red wax, like a small lion, that has learned obedience, and the house that once held time in order begins to slip. The rule does not change. The men who lived by it are told they must live elsewhere. Some will become parish priests. Some will teach. A few old, stubborn, or simply unable to imagine a life without the bell will cling and be peeled loose. The fields do not notice that day. The oxen do not flinch. But the ledger moves from one desk to another, and with it the right to say who stands where at harvest. Land is the slowest thing a kingdom can move, and the most dangerous. Parcels that had once been leased with a father's handshake and a prayer now pass under the eyes of men who prefer parchment to breath. Some tenants, careful and lucky, find their rents, reconfirmed coin, punctual, with fewer holy days kept but the same furrows to hold straight. Others discover that what their fathers held by favour is exactly that, favour, which can be folded and put away. A strip that fed a family becomes a ribbon annexed to a gentleman's ambition. The boundary stones are not shifted. The meaning of the stones is enclosure, a word that used to mean care, begins to mean fences that do not accept conversation. The bell keeps ringing for a while because even kings cannot outlaw habit. Prime, tercer, sexed hours sluice through the parish as they always did, and the clock's foliot still argues with winter and summer in the old amiable way. But where a monk once lifted the host, a vicar now turns more pages in a book with more English. Where beeswax once burned like a small sun in the north aisle for St. Hen, Benedict's Guild, there is a plain tallow stub that does its job without pretending to be eloquent. The saints on the wall fade a degree faster, because no one freshens their faces with a faithful brush. Some are lime-washed altogether, their eyes buried under a clean forgetfulness. The boys, who remember where St. Christopher's big toe used to be, kick pebbles at the blank and argue about whether memory or paint is stronger. Markets grow louder. It is not only that wool pays well, though it does. Until it doesn't, it is that coin begins to sound like certainty to ears that have been trained to love routine. A man who once counted his worth in lambs and loaves now measures in pennies and promises backed by other people's pennies. A woman who spun for household and neighbour tries a longer warp and sells cloth to a factor whose name she could not spell and does not need to. The alehouse learns new songs about kings and a few about conscience. The old songs about ploughing and women who can outwit both weather and men keep their places near the fire. In the corner, two lads sharpen their future on ideas they picked up from a travelling preacher who said grace could not be rented by the ounce. The priest sighs and practices not flinching. There are kindnesses in the shuffling, and they deserve to be remembered. A former monk, hands still ink-stained, opens a school in a corner of the old guest hall. Boys who once would have learned only hedges and harness learn letters enough to argue with a page. A widow buys, with 3 cousins and a stubborn will, the lease to a small meadow the monastery had held for the use of visitors, and it becomes a dairy that keeps 5 households in milk even in thin months. The guild, unmoored from its altar, keeps its chest and its list of names and continues to pay out for blankets, candles, and the occasional cow. Charities move from stone rooms to kitchen tables and survive. But there are griefs that cannot be tidied. The great bell is sold, not because anyone wants to sell it, but because bronze has a price, and roofs do too. And the man who buys bells does not buy silence. He buys future cannon, perhaps, or smaller bells for newer towers, somewhere else that have learned to pray in a different accent. when the clapper is taken down, the sound it makes against the floor, one last indiscretion turns heads in the yard. Men look away. Women do not. The tower keeps its shape, which is almost worse. The fields notice in their own way. An abbot's steward used to forgive a late rind of cheese when the year had been wet and the cows untheological. The new owner's agent keeps to the letter because he is paid to keep to the letter, and also because letters are the only shelter he trusts. Common rights grazing, gleaning, firewood shrink, not overnight, but measurably. Like a shirt a child keeps wearing because he loves it and does not see that it has become argument rather than clothing. A hedge that once held a negotiated gap is laid hard, and a woman who used to walk her geese through at dusk doubts her memory before she doubts the new rule. And yet people go on because people are astonishing. They rearrange their loyalties the way furniture is shifted to fit a new wall, grudgingly, cleverly, with jokes, with scratches on the floor that will be polished out by the next generation. The calendar thins of saints' days and nevertheless manages to accumulate reasons to gather royal birthdays that arrive with bonfires. Harvest suppers that no proclamation can outlaw. Church ales, renamed as something else, but tasting the same. Children born after the worst of it do not miss what they have not learned to name. They hear English at the altar and think God had always preferred this village's vowels. They watch their mothers count coin into a steward's purse and believe this is what rent has always looked like. If there is a single difference that settles into the marrow, it is this: time belongs less to bells and more to books. Not every household owns a Bible that will be a while yet, but the idea that words might sit in a lap and speak to a man without a priest in the room is a seed with its own weather. A weaver copies a psalm phonetically into a scrap ledger so he can hum it without visiting the church. A woman learns to sign her name instead of the old cross and feels her wrist blush with ownership. The clock in the tower argues, as it always has, with summer and winter. But inside heads, a quieter mechanism begins to tick. You can object that politics drove all this, and you would not be wrong. You can add that desire for heirs, for power, for household peace that will not be mediated by Rome walked arm in arm with doctrine, and you would still be describing less than the whole. The whole lives in the way a parish stands at the edge of a field at dusk the first spring after the dissolution and listens. The barley is coming. The lambs are on their legs. The new steward has a face someone will eventually like. The bell is gone. The bell remains. In wrists that remember how to pause. In breaths that remember when to begin again. When Compline should have rung, a woman lays a hand on a child's hair and says a prayer without a bell to hold it upright. It stands on its own. By the time the old monks have been settled in cottages or gone to God, the kingdom has learned to walk in its new shoes. They pinch. They also last. Because leather forgets where it began and remembers only the feet that taught it. The farm keeps its bargains with mud and weather. Pigs with doctorates in mischief still examine fences. The loom in the corner still turns patience into fabric. In October, the threshing floor receives sheaves that do not care who owns them, only that they were carried in dry. In January, the rushlight works its dim spell and the house obeys, eyes narrowing to the circle of light that is enough. Standing at the threshold, 1 foot in the old world, 1 in the amended, you might be tempted to choose between them, as if history were a market stall. It is not. It is a recipe book, with smudged pages and substitutions, penciled in the margins, fewer saints. More coin, fewer holy days. More markets, less Latin. More letters in laps. Less monastery. More parish stitched to itself by habit and hunger, and a bull-headed refusal to vanish. When the wind comes hard over the downs and makes the thatch lift like a questioning eyebrow, the house lowers its beams and answers. And the land, which has never cared what men have called God, so long as they remembered to rotate their crops, keeps its side of the bargain. The furrow takes its line. The seed takes its time. The people take a breath and begin again. You've just walked through another forgotten corner of the past, not the world of kings or saints, but the quieter country where most of humanity has always lived. The small rooms, the muddy fields, the faith that bends but doesn't break. These are the places where history truly breathes. Here at Poor Historian, we don't chase the noise of glory. We listen for the whispers, the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the last meal from a pot. The hush before a bell tolls the breath of someone still alive after everyone richer has gone. The poor never wrote their stories, so we try to lend them a voice slow and steady, the way truth prefers to travel. If you've stayed this long, perhaps something in those voices found you. Maybe you recognized a little of yourself in their endurance, the quiet act of getting up again, of doing the work that no one will ever sing about. That's what this channel exists for, to remind us that survival is not small, that dignity can live in the dirt, and that memory is the gentlest kind of rebellion. Take a moment before you go. Let the sound of their world fade but not vanish. Picture the candlelight softening the corners of a cottage, or the hush that follows when the last tool is put away. Those lives are long gone, but their echoes are patient. They wait for anyone willing to listen without hurry. If you want to keep walking these narrow paths of the past, the ones that smell of smoke, sweat, and stories, you can help them stay lit. Subscribe to Poor Historian and let history find you when the world gets too loud. Leave a comment if a scene or a sentence stayed with you. That's how we keep these voices alive. And if this journey brought you a little calm, a little wonder, or just a better kind of silence, share it. Someone else might need that stillness too. There are more lives waiting here. Peasants, healers, builders, soldiers, mothers, ordinary souls who made the Middle Ages anything but dull. Their stories don't demand attention, they earn it. Each one is another piece of the great mosaic of how we got here, not through brilliance or conquest, but through persistence. So as you close your eyes or drift into sleep, remember this history isn't only what was written, it's what was endured. And somewhere, in the dust between centuries, the poor are still telling their stories, softly, stubbornly, gratefully, to anyone willing to listen. Thanks for listening, for remembering, and for keeping company with the forgotten. We'll meet again in the next quiet story.